Continuing on, I decided to break this in half at the point of explaining this, because as I mentioned to you, that economists typically don't like to give an explanation of why a recession starts or why the economy pulls itself out of the trough, and it has to do with real income. Okay, we talked about the distinction between real gross domestic product and nominal gross domestic product. And the difference between the two was that real gross domestic product incorporates changes in prices, okay, whereas nominal does not. This is very similar to that. When we talk about income levels and income coming in, okay, the wage that we're making and the income itself nominally are relatively meaningless unless we also look at prices. Remember, money flows in and money flows out. Well, the money that flows into me is relatively pointless unless I also consider how much money is flowing out. Okay? So we look now at what's called the wage price ratio, and this is one that you can look up. This is on the BLS, which is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They mark this. They mark this. Okay. During the growth cycle, let's look at this first. During the growth cycle, what do we know? Let's go back, print out that PowerPoint and take a look at it. At that growth cycle. Okay. When the demand for labor bottoms out, when production is at its bottom, okay, prices and wages are both at their low point. It reaches a point where the change in wages going up is greater than the change in prices. Okay? If the change in wages is greater than the change in prices, then you have greater real income. I'll explain it this way with a simple numerical example that I can do in my head, because it's simple. All right? Let's suppose my wage is $5 and the price is $1. That means I can buy 5 units, right? That's what they call purchasing power. All right? And by 5 units. But if my wage is $5 and the price is $2, I can only purchase 2.5 units. My purchasing power has gone down. I have the same wage. Okay? So what happens in the growth cycle is because demand is up, okay, production increases, they need more laborers, the demand for labor goes up, and so wages are rising, okay? But demand is also up, and so prices are going to go up. The demand curve, both for labor and for products, is shifting outward. And so at the same time wages are going up because the demand for labor is up, so too prices are going up because the demand for goods and services are up. There's a strange phenomenon. The increase in wages, okay, precedes the increase in prices. Why? Because before I'm going to go and spend any money, I have to have an increase in real wages. Okay, I have to have more purchasing power. Once that happens, I'm going to go out and spend money. That's going to shift the demand curve. Once the demand curve shifts, prices begin to rise. So there's a time lag. Wages start rising, then prices start rising. That's growth. It reaches the point where the change in wages going up slows down. The change in prices going up catches up to it. This is at the peak, where the change in wages is equal to the change in prices. People neither have more nor less purchasing power. They're at the peak. However, once the change in wages flattens out, that temporal lag that we identified down here, where wages start outgrowing, people start demanding, and then prices start outgrowing. Well, wages flatten out, And prices, there's a time lag. Prices continue to rise. Because that happens, the change in wages becomes less than the change in price. The change in wage less than the change in price, at which time people have less purchasing power, and so they stop spending money. When they stop spending money, demand goes down and it triggers the debt cycle. That's what triggers the recession. So what I watch for, and again, this is the explanation I proffer for it. Many economists offer many explanations. It's probably why economics textbooks don't really include a lengthy discussion of why this happens, because there is no consensual agreement. This is the one that logically makes the most sense to me. And so what I watch for at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, okay, is the wage price ratio, the growth in real wages as compared to prices. If the real wages are continuing to go up, people have more purchasing power and they will continue to spend, and the recession will be offset. It will be delayed, okay? Typically, and I haven't quite launched into the full data analysis of this, but typically, if wages drop below prices, if the change in wage drops below the change in price for better than 3 months, a recession is on the way, okay? Because it means people have less purchasing power. Now, they'll keep the spending up a little bit through debt by buying more than they can actually afford, by buying greater than their income, but that can't be sustained indefinitely. As we found out in 2008, you can't sustain debt indefinitely, but at any rate, then it will start down. Looking at a numerical example of that, let us suppose that wages are $1,000. The price is $10. Okay, the delta is what we use to refer to as change in. Okay, so my purchasing power is $1,000 divided by 10, the price of the unit. Okay, so I can afford 100 units. During the growth period, the change in wages going up is greater than the change in prices going up. So let's say the change in wages is 5% and the change in prices, inflation, is 3%. Okay, people are always concerned with inflation. Inflation's 2%, inflation's 3%. We don't really give a damn. As long as I'm making enough money to at least offset the inflation rate, then I'm actually better off. All right, and so here, let's suppose prices are going up by 3%, okay? Which, if you listen to the pop economists and news media, they would tell you begin to panic, all right? Don't begin to panic. Instead, look at this. What are wages going up? If wages are going up greater than prices, you're not in bad shape. You're in better shape, actually, because look at this, okay? We start off with $1,010. We can buy 100 units. Now, the new wage, 5% increase. That brings us to 1,050. The new price, a 3% increase, $10.30. Okay, hence, this is our total wage. This is the price. We can now afford actually more, can't we? We can afford 101.94 units. Because our real purchasing power has gone up, we spend more money. That means the economy is going to continue to grow. Demand is going to continue to shift outward. Okay, so real income went up is reflected in increased purchasing power. This will result in increased demand, which shifts demand curve outward, which is the growth cycle. Okay, when we get to the peak, that change in wages becomes equal to the change in prices. So now let's let the change in wages go. Let wages go up 4% and prices go up 4%. They are equal. Okay, now that means from our $1,050 income that we had in the last slide, a 4% increase brings us to $1,092. The 4% increase in prices from the $10.30 that we had in the last slide brings us to $10.71.2 for a purchasing power, meaning how many units I can buy, of 101.94. Well, that's what it was last time. Okay, so I'm even. I've broken even. Because I've broken even, I'm not going to increase spending. Okay, I have the same purchasing power I had before, so I'm not going to increase spending. So everything's unchanged. That's the peak. Okay. The reason we get into the recession is because of the temporal lag that I mentioned at the outset of explaining this. Okay, because there is a temporal lag, The change in wages going up is now going to, while wages flatten out, prices are going to continue to go up. This is currently, when we get to monetary policy and the current monetary policy of Jerome Powell and the Fed, this is what they're trying to retard doing. They're trying to keep prices from rising too much, particularly above wages. It is going to happen. It is an inevitability. But you want to try to limit how much. Okay? So now again, we're still having an increase in wages, this time of 3%. But this time the change in prices goes up to 5%, the change in price greater than the change in wage. This price increase continues. Hence, given what we had in the previous slide as our wage, we increase it by 3%. We now make $1124.76. Okay? But the price increase from before now is going to be 5%, which means prices go to $1124.76. My purchasing power is now down to 100 units. That's a decline in real income. Because I have a decline in real income, I'm going to stop spending. Because I stop spending, it triggers the debt cycle. Okay? And that's why people have great difficulty understanding this idea. They wherever they're working, they get a pay bump, and they're very happy about that. A pay bump is meaningless unless we also think about the bump in prices. Okay? If I get a pay bump of 2% and prices rise 5%, I'm actually worse off. Okay? And we'll deal with that when we get to the idea of a cost of living adjustment. Cost of living adjustment is where you index wage increases to the inflation rate. They do that, for example, for Social Security. Okay, people get more Social Security each year because they do a COLA allowance. They adjust the amount of Social Security transfer payment you're getting to the inflation rate. Which brings us ultimately to the lengthier discussion of inflation itself. Okay, and inflation is a general rise in prices. That's the definition of it. It's measured by the consumer price index, which we're not going to have to worry ourselves with that much. We worry about it a little bit more in macroeconomics when we do a more in-depth class on macro. For us, the CPI is an average price of a basket of 300 goods. Okay, now the question is, what causes the inflation? And there is a raging debate about this. The classical approach has to do with aggregate demand and or aggregate supply. Okay, there's demand pull inflation. During a growth cycle, demand is up, people are demanding more, people are buying more, so aggregate demand slides up, the demand curve slides outward, and if you look at the result of that, it's an increase in prices, which is inflation. Okay, fine, that's one. The other explanation is cost push. If producers have to pay more, one of the main reasons for supply curve shifts that we looked at in our discussion of microeconomics was an increase in the cost of production, increase in the factors of production, increase in the cost of the factors of production, I guess I should say. Okay, that slides the supply curve inward. The result, you can see, is an increase in prices. Okay. The monetarist approach, which was created by Milton Friedman in the 1950s, for which he won the Nobel Prize, okay, is a very different approach to this. It's based on opportunity cost. And it is that inflation is a result of the relationship of the supply of goods and services to the supply of money. The classical approach makes no reference to money, okay? And I should probably tell you that I am a monetarist, okay? It's the supply of goods and services and its relation to the supply of money. This is what the Federal Reserve does. This is one of its main purposes. It measures the balance between these two things as best it can. Here we see the graphic depiction of the classical approach. Here's the demand pull inflation. The demand curve slides outward to the right, prices rise. Here's the cost push. The supply curve slides inward to the left. The result is an increase in price. The monetarist approach has to do with opportunity cost and the balance of the supply of goods and services and the supply of money. And the example I always use, I use this in my history class because whenever we talk about when we do U.S. history, inevitably we run into I'm one of the very few people. In fact, I think I'm the only person that brings an actual discussion of U.S. economic development during U.S. history. Most people just kind of slough it off. But this is my classic banana example. Okay, it's opportunity cost. Okay, let us suppose that in our economy, our supply of goods and services, the only thing we produce are bananas. So we have 100 bananas. Our supply of money is $100. Okay, and opportunity cost, that means I can either hold, and you could see this, picture in your mind, draw it on a piece of paper, the production possibility curve. I can either have $100, or I can have 100 bananas, or I can have any combination of the two. Now, in this case, the resources are fungible, okay, meaning infinitely fungible, meaning it's a straight line, okay? So I can either have $50 and 50 bananas, or $2 and 98 bananas, or $100 and 0 bananas, or 100 bananas and $0, etc. Therefore, 100 bananas and $100 means that one banana is the equivalent of $1. With me so far? Now, let's suppose our supply of bananas increases by 100, while the supply of money stays the same. We don't increase the supply of money at all. Now, you have 200 bananas. You still have $100. Now you have 2 bananas for $1. This is called deflation. Why? Because back here, $1 was the equivalent of 1 banana. Now $1 is the equivalent of 2 bananas. The price of bananas has been cut in half. Now let's change that. Let's say the supply of bananas remains constant while the supply of dollars doubles. Now you should have your original 100 bananas, but you've massively increased, you've doubled your supply of money to $200. So now 1 banana is $2. This is inflation, okay? The banana which went 1 for 1, $100, 100 bananas. Now you have 100 bananas and $200. Now 1 banana is $2, okay? That's an increase in prices. This is the monetarist approach to it. This is why the Federal Reserve has been applying this more and more and more since the late 80s, okay? And that's why you've had 2 exceedingly long growth cycles, one in the 90s and another from 2009 till now, is because they've been applying this and monitoring. The difficult thing with this approach is that you really have to pay attention to the actual output of goods and services and the actual supply of money. And we'll look at how the Fed does that, okay, with greater and lesser degrees of success. And as I've said, inflation accounting is CPI. And I give you here, I'm not going to ask you to actually calculate based on changes in it, but this is how it's actually done. It's based on an index. And you can look through this. Okay, the base year index is 100. Okay, so if in any given year you have an increase, this is the price of the basket of goods, say $500. Okay, that's why it's 100. If it goes up 10%, if the basket of 300 goods is now instead of $500, $550, we take that, the base level from that, divide it by the base level, multiply by 100, and then add it to the index, and you get 110. Okay, the 10% increase in prices. I don't like that. There's a lot of problems with CPI. I'm not a big fan of the CPI. It goes beyond the fact. I mean, even the monetarists use the CPI to measure inflation. There are other ways of measuring it, and there's a number of reasons that I don't like it. One of them is, and I suppose it's because they're intermediate goods. One of them is because food, okay, and fuel are not included in that basket. Now, I don't know about you, okay, but my gas and my food are 2 of my largest expenses. Okay, and as we watch the tumultuous fluctuation in gas prices, that's not included in the CPI. Now, the reason that they don't include it is because they don't include food and fuel because fuel is an intermediate good. It's used by both consumers and producers to produce something else, so we'll include the price in the finished product. Okay, good enough, fair enough. Okay. Same thing with food. Food is the intermediate good of all laborers. Okay. Well, the increases in food costs are going to be reflected in the increased price of the finished product that I produce. Yeah, maybe, maybe not. Okay. There's a lot of problems with the CPI. But at any rate, that's it. You should probably know how to calculate it, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps track of it. All right. Here we have just the graphic, and this comes, as you see, from the BLS. This is the inflation rate in the United States from 2001 to 2017. You see that it started out here at a fairly low level of 1.5. During the 90s, it fluctuated right around in this area, very narrow parameter, between about 1.2 and 1.7. It spikes here. Then you have this recession, okay? Remember that a recession is noted, that debt cycle, okay? One of the things that goes with it when we talk about the wage-price ratio is a reduction in prices, okay? So prices drop down, then during this growth stage they go back up, they level out, then they start going down again, then they rise up, then they go back down again, and prices, I should mention this, actually, that's a little bit unclear. This is the growth rate, okay? This is the inflation rate. That's how much prices are going up. And so it's the inflation rate that's dropping down. You don't actually have a reduction in prices till 2008 during the recession, okay? And you see, this is the Great Recession. Not only did inflation stop rising, but it went to a negative number. That's an indication that prices are going down, okay? And then it fluctuated here. And right now, the inflation rate is in the neighborhood of 2.5%. We're right here right now, okay, as we move into 2019. One of the problems is we don't have the year-end 2018 data yet. Typically, it doesn't come out until the end of January, but there's going to be a delay in that because in the partial government shutdown that took place at the end of 2018, one of the things that got shut down were the Bureau of Labor Statistics and Bureau of Economic Analysis. And so they're not gathering the data. That's great for we economists that exist on data, but whatever. So that's the inflation rate, okay, over time. And you see it fluctuates with the business cycle. It fluctuates with the business cycle. As you reach the peak, this was the peak of the business cycle last time that we hit in 2007 before the recession. Okay, you have your highest inflation rate, the bottom of the trough, okay? And so they're trying to prevent inflation from rising this high again, but to maintain the economic growth. Right now, as I say, we're right about here. If we were to reach there, does that mean suddenly a recession is going to be triggered? No, it does not mean that at all. Look how high it was before the last one was triggered. But at any rate, okay. So, and we'll deal with that again when we deal with more fiscal and monetary policy. Now to discuss the effects of inflation and who inflation hurts and who inflation helps. Inflation, well, it does. Okay. Here's how we figure this out. Okay. When it comes to inflation, when inflation does is it reduces the value of money. All right. We go back to the original lecture and we say, okay, because of opportunity cost and the sacrifice ratio, the more you have of something, the less valuable each of them is. This is the reason for diminishing utility. Okay, the more I have of it, the less valuable each of them is. All right, that's true of dollars as well. Okay, and how we figure it out is we take the amount of money we have minus the amount of money times the inflation rate. That gives us our actual value. Okay, now first we look at debtors and creditors, lenders and debtors, lenders and borrowers. Okay, lenders are hurt by inflation. Debtors are better off. Why? Because when I borrow money and then pay it back at some time in the future, the money I'm paying back per dollar is worth less than the money that I gained or the money that I borrowed. Okay? The lender gets hurt by this. And so, for example, the debtor borrows $10,000 at 5% interest. They're going to have to pay back $10,500. But if inflation is greater than 5%, say inflation's 10%, then I pay back the $10,500 minus 10% because that's the value of it, right? That's $1,050. I'm actually only paying them back $9,450. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks this. It's kind of interesting. If you go onto the Bureau of Labor Statistics and look at the inflation calculator, you can see this. So, for example, the house that I grew up in that my parents bought when I was, I don't know, 10, I think it was 10, 9 or 10, right? They bought it for $78,000. Okay. To sell that thing, to break even, we would have had to sell that for $350,000. What that means is that $350,000, 2018 dollars is the same as $78,000, 1973 dollars. Okay, every year money loses its value. If you go back to the 1920s and 1930s, okay, back in the 1920s, $400,000 is worth today about $4.5 million. Okay, the longer it goes, the longer the term, okay, the more inflation is going to eat out of it. We deal with this a good bit when it comes to investment in terms of the present value of future earnings. Future earnings of anything are always reduced by the potential inflation rate. And that's why we look at inflation rates. How lenders compensate themselves, this is what the interest rate is. The interest rate is the price of money. The interest rate is the price of borrowing money. Okay, the more I think inflation is going to eat money, the more inflation is going to eat the value of it, the higher my interest rate's going to be. Okay, to get back what I lent out. Okay. The other ones that it hurts, that inflation hurts quite a bit, are people on a fixed income or people that have a savings. And let's look at this. Let's suppose that I'm getting fixed income of $10,000. Okay. Well, with 10% inflation, that's the same purchasing power as $9,000. Okay. With savings, if I have $10,000 in savings and there's 10% inflation, that $10,000 is now worth $9,000. And I mentioned this before. This is why they build in a cost of living adjustment, particularly to transfer payments. Okay? Because the amount of money that they're giving me this year, because of inflation, the same amount of money will buy less next year. And so they index the two things together. They index the increases in transfer payments, and they do this, employers do this too. This is one of the things that contract negotiations do, is they try to factor in a cost of living adjustment, okay? So that you can compensate against inflation, so that you end up with some sort of real income increase going on. The other consequence of the business cycle that we talked about is unemployment. And inflation is associated because of increases in demand and things like that. The inflation is generally associated with the growth cycle. Unemployment is generally associated with the recessionary cycle. That's when unemployment is on the rise. And first of all, let's look at the definition of unemployment. That's the people that are not employed members of the labor force divided by the labor force. Okay, the labor force by definition is those people over the age of 16 that are either working or seeking work. Generally, it's about 50% of the population, give or take, a little bit up, a little bit down. And so there's a few things with that. If they're not seeking work, they're not counted as part of the labor force, and therefore they don't qualify in the employment or unemployment. So when you see an unemployment number of 3.5% or 4%, that's a little bit deceptive. It's not, I mean, it doesn't mean 97% of your population is working. Okay, it doesn't even mean 97% of the people over age 16 are working. Okay, people that are incarcerated, people that are in institutions, they don't count. Students don't count. Okay, these are people that are either working or seeking work. Okay, and I've mentioned this before, the natural rate of unemployment, maximum employment level given available capital. Okay, between 3 and 5% now is what they estimate it to be. Right now, we're just over 3%. Aggregate capital saturation point is what we talked about the capital saturation point. This is the aggregate for the economy at large. There are and we want to differentiate between these. There are three types of unemployment. The first of them is frictional unemployment. This is temporary, okay? Seasonal employment. For example, lifeguards, okay? Lifeguards are unemployed typically in the fall and winter, okay, when pools aren't open. That doesn't count, okay? They're frictionally unemployed. It's only temporary. Their job is coming back. Lateral career movements, okay? In other words, as I work my way up in my career, I start out somewhere, and then I quit to move to another job. That too is temporary. That's not going to happen, okay? One of my buddies was a roofer. Okay, well, roofers in the wintertime are always unemployed. That's frictional unemployment, okay? The second one, and the more significant one, is structural unemployment. This is permanent unemployment, okay? The two major sources of this are technology and outsourcing, okay? And this is one of the things that the Trump administration has addressed itself to, is this idea of outsourcing, and that all the jobs are going to Mexico and China, and right? The largest cause of structural unemployment in U.S. history is not outsourcing the job to a cheaper labor market where you can pay the workers less. The largest source of unemployment is technology, technological improvements. And I'll give you a quick example. Let's go back. I made this example of being a house foundation digger, right? A contractor that digs foundations. And I start out with a company and we have no technology of any kind. So all my workers, they have to dig the foundations by hand, okay, literally with their hands, okay? So I need 50 of them to dig a foundation, okay? I go out and I buy a bunch of shovels. Well, now as a result of the technological improvement, I only need 25 of them. That's 25 jobs that go away. They ain't coming back, okay? I now go out and buy myself a backhoe, and I can operate that myself. I fire the rest of the guys, okay? That's 50 people thrown out of work, okay? That's structural unemployment, all right? Technology is the primary source of structural unemployment, not outsourcing. Outsourcing actually is counterinflationary, because if you get your production done at a really low labor wage area, all other things being equal, it'll keep the price down. But at any rate, we'll deal with that later when we get to international economics a little bit more. The only one that's counted in the business cycle is cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment, okay, the other two have nothing whatsoever to do with the business cycle. The one is a result of technology or outsourcing. The other is kind of an optional thing by the laborer, okay, depending on what job they choose, depending on whether or not they're going to make a lateral movement, okay, has nothing to do with the business cycle whatsoever. This is the only one that has to do with the business cycle, okay, and we go back again, refer back to the growth cycle and the debt cycle, or the growth cycle and the recessionary cycle, okay. This is associated with the recessionary cycle. During the growth cycle, demand for labor is up, and so unemployment is down, all right? That flattens out. Eventually, people stop spending money. Because they stop spending money, people don't have to produce as much. Because they don't produce as much, they don't need as many laborers, and so employment levels drop and unemployment goes up. That's as a result of the business cycle. That's what we count in the unemployment rate, okay? So when the unemployment rate continues to drop, that's because you're in the growth stage of the business cycle, okay? All right. This is now just kind of, again, this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is the U.S. unemployment annual average. They track it on a monthly basis. This is the annual average. I think I took it from December of every year from 1990 till 2018, or maybe I took it from January from 1990 to 2018. And this is the unemployment rate. And you see where the spikes are. This massive spike is the result of the Great Recession, okay, where it topped out at almost 10%. This was the peak of this was the trough of the last recession, which was 92, just before the Clinton administration came in 93. And then you have the unemployment dropping during that whole period. This is the next recession in 2001, where unemployment is on the rise. Then you have this growth cycle till you hit 2007, 2008. Then the Great Recession hits and we have a spike in unemployment. And now unemployment has been dropping. And now we're dropped even below that. We're down here somewhere right now. And the question, of course, is how long is it going to keep going down? How long can they keep producing jobs? Last month, they produced 312,000 jobs. The unemployment rate fell again. There are some other things that drop the unemployment rate. People leaving the labor force is going to drop it. Okay, so that's the unemployment. We now look at this. This is the Phillips curve. We still use it, but there are some anomalies with the Phillips curve. Okay, inflation is associated with the growth stage in the business cycle because incomes are up, demand is up, the demand for labor is up, okay, and so prices are rising, and so you have inflation. Well, because you're at the growth stage, the same phenomenon that's causing the increase in prices is also causing employment to go up and unemployment to go down. So typically we associate higher inflation with lower unemployment. And so too, the opposite is true. During a recessionary cycle, nobody's spending, demand is down, demand is dropping, and so prices are dropping, and at the same time, unemployment's going up. Okay, that's the basic Phillips curve. There's problems with this, though. Okay, during the 1990s, you had consistently 3% growth. Okay, if you look at that lengthy growth cycle that we had before the Great Recession, you had better than 3% growth a year. Okay, and so you had this inflationary idea. It wasn't rampant inflation, it was inflation. It was during the growth cycle. Well, at the same time, you had very low unemployment rates. All right, or you had the two big areas where the Phillips curve was kind of discredited was in the 1980s, just prior to the 1980s, as a result of the stagflation. What stagflation is when you have high both. Okay, so what the Reagan administration inherited in 81 was double-digit inflation and double-digit recession and double-digit unemployment out here. Okay, and what the Clinton administration inherited was very low inflation and very low unemployment. All right, that's according to the Phillips curve, that shouldn't happen, and it does. And one of the things that it shows with the Phillips curve and the discrediting of the Phillips curve and why it doesn't really work that way anymore, or it never really worked that way, or there are anomalies to it, is because the inflation rate is not simply a product of the business cycle. It's really a question of the supply of goods and services versus the supply of money. If you keep those two things relatively consistent, if you keep the supply of money even with the supply of goods and services, you have a very low inflation rate. Well, during a growth cycle, if you do that, you'll also have a very low unemployment rate. This is the 1990s. This is 2001 to 2007. This is current. Okay, you have a fairly low inflation rate and a very low unemployment rate, so you're down here. Okay, that's kind of support for the monetarist hypothesis. But at any rate, I threw the Phillips curve in here just because to show you this is the traditional way of looking at it. It doesn't quite work out that way. We have enough anomalies that it hasn't been entirely discredited, but it certainly isn't as true as it used to be. And that's one of the supports for the monetarist approach to what causes inflation. And we'll deal with that more when we get to monetary policy a little bit. And that concludes the discussion of business cycles and gross domestic product.